Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but she hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible. The Dursleys shuddered to think about what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, grey Tuesday, our story starts. There is nothing about the cloudy sky outside today that suggested anything strange or mysterious would be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled the screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl fluttering past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the wall. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed up the number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first signs of something peculiar: a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realise what he had seen, but he jerked his head and ran to take a look again, and there was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove away around the corner up the road, he watched the cat in the mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw in young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on the huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley. This was always some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in Grunning's car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it hard to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down the streets did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the street to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgot all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but it made him uneasy. They were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in the bag, that he caught a few words that they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if they wanted to say something to him, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking, no. He was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. When he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into somebody just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted. As the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell, it was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." An old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted on the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he was called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. He pulled into the driveway of number 4. The first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted this morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. "Shoo," said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behaviour? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley has had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about next door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had went a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report in the evening. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreaders allowed himself a grin. Mostly seriously, and now over to Jim McGuffin with today's weather. "Won't there be any showers of owls tonight, Jim?" "Well, Ted, said I don't know about that, but it's not the only owls that have been acting all day. Viewers as far as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning and saying that instead of rain, I promised yesterday, I'd a downpour, shooting star. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in an armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. "Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretend she didn't have any sister. "No," she said sharply. "Why?" "Funny stuff on the news," Mr. Dursley mumbled. "Owls shooting stars. And there was a lot of funny-looking people in town today." "So?" snapped Mrs. Dursley. "Well, I thought maybe it was just something to do with, her law." Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea, pursed lips. Mr. Dudley wondered whether he dared tell her that he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said as casually, "Their son, he's about Dudley's now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so." "What's his name again? Harold, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley. His heart sank horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as he went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom Mr. Dursley crept to the bathroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. He was imagining things. Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. Dursley's gone into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Virginia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Virginia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might be drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall inside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sat as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before a cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner, and the cat had been watching appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver in his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realise that he had just arrived in the street, where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realise he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He had found what he was looking for in his inside pockets. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it to the air, and clicked. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put outer, until the only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window, nor even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the putter-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the same as the markings the tabby cat had round her eyes. She too was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctively ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day, when you could have been celebrating. I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everyone's celebrating, all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more capable, but no, even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on the news." She jerked her head back into Dursley's dark living room. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something.